Well, it's been 5 months since I've posted a video on this platform, so let's just get right into it. All right, so obviously by the title of this video, you know what we're gonna be talking about today. We're gonna be talking about some beginner filmmaking mistakes and what I see people doing when they're just starting doing video stuff and just getting into this whole industry. And I did these things too, so it's not a bad thing if you're doing these, but hopefully this video helps you shorten that learning curve and to cut these habits out of your filmmaking. So mistake number one that we're gonna be talking about today is bad framing. Now, bad framing is somewhat of a touchy subject because it varies depending on who's shooting, but there are some general rules to framing that you want to focus on when you're shooting video. Those are things like the rule of thirds, headroom, making sure the audience's attention is drawn to the subject. But obviously, once you know those rules, you can sway off of them as you please. So if we're gonna get into mistake number one, let's talk about the rule of thirds first. We're gonna be using some examples from a poker scene I shot. And as far as rule of thirds goes, you should see here on the screen, there are 2 lines going vertically and 2 lines going horizontally. Generally, the rule of thirds, you want to keep your subject on one of those intersections of the points. Once you know this rule, you can pivot off of it to convey different emotions, such as putting your subject right in the dead center, or putting them at the bottom of the frame or the top of the frame to feel claustrophobic or more open. There are a ton of different ways you can go with this, but knowing this rule of thirds is the first step in making sure your framing is better. So now I'm gonna show you an example of some bad framing. This is some framing that you would not want to do. As you can tell, it's hard to find where you're supposed to be looking or what's in focus. There's also too much empty space, and that's something you wanna cut back on. Now let's go over to the good framing. As you can see here, the subject, you know exactly where you should be looking. The rule of thirds is right on. There's enough headroom for your subject, and everything is how it should be. Now let's move on to mistake number 2, and that is changing your exposure on the fly or using auto ISO. Now, disclaimer just before we get started, I'm not saying auto ISO should never be used or changing it on the fly should never be used, but when doing professional work for clients and shooting short films and the high-end stuff, you should lock your settings in before you're actually shooting these things and not letting the camera do whatever the hell it wants. In this case, we're gonna be talking about the higher end client work in the short films, not generally vlogs and quick run and gun types of videos. In those types of videos, by all means, use whatever you want. That is totally okay. Now, an example of why I picked this mistake is because I was shooting an event about 2 years ago and I was filming a concert, and when I was shooting it, I would constantly switch the ISO in between shots, going from 400 ISO to 800 ISO. And one problem that I ran into when I got back to editing was a lot of the shots weren't usable because I was switching the exposure in the middle of the shot. Now, it doesn't seem like a huge thing, but when you're color grading and you're matching the levels of each shot, the audience can tell when you are switching your exposure if the image gets brighter or darker, and that's a little bit jarring to the audience. The main reason this usually happens when people are starting out is because they start their shot, whether it be on a gimbal or handheld, and in the middle of the shot, they realize, oh shit, this isn't bright enough, or oh no, it's too bright, so I have to darken it, and then they switch it in the middle of the shot. If that's the case, it's always better to just restart the shot, set your settings where you want them to be, and go from there. I can't count on my fingers how many times I did this when I was starting, and after you look back at old projects, you realize, okay, that's something I need to stop doing. But like I said, disclaimer at the beginning, it's okay if you're doing this in vlogs or YouTube videos or Instagram stories, whatever. People aren't going to notice it as much, but you know, if you're shooting stuff for TV or movies, those are things people notice. So here's an example of the same poker scene. The first sequence you guys are going to be looking at is the exposure change in the middle of the shot. And as you can tell, it's a little bit jarring. You don't really understand why it's there, and it takes you out of the story. Now, the second sequence we are showing here is properly exposed the whole entire time. The image does not change, and everything is locked into its settings before the shot begins. All right, now we're gonna move into our third mistake, and this is a lot like auto exposure, but it is auto white balance. Now, I know white balance can be intimidating when you're just starting video stuff because you're not sure what kind of white balance you should use in different scenarios or shoots, or what color temperature lights are. But as you start practicing those things, it becomes quicker, becomes simpler, you start to learn, and it becomes second nature. So start at the beginning while you can to learn those color temperatures and to learn what scenarios need what type of white balance, and you'll thank me in the long run. So just like auto exposure, this is an absolute nightmare if you are switching between white balances in the middle of shots. So what your camera is actually doing is it is taking the white balance and setting it at the beginning of the shot. But if something in frame moves, like someone walks across with a different colored white t-shirt, or you pan over to a different colored white wall, your camera is trying to auto adjust to those new white pieces in your scene. And you don't want that, because then your image might go from a super warm image to a very cool image, and that transition in the middle of a shot when the audience is watching does not look good. It does not look professional, and you'll never see that in Hollywood films. Another big reason why you don't want to do this is it is a nightmare to color grade in post. If you are balancing a shot for one wall and everything's white balanced properly, and halfway through the shot everything's now blue or everything's now yellow and it doesn't match the first half of the shot, it is going to give you the biggest headache ever. The third reason why you do not want to use auto white balance is because if you're going for a look or a mood and you dial those stylistic changes in on set, like you are going for a very warm look because it's in the summer or during sunset, or a very cool look because you're in a basement or an alleyway, those colors changing in the middle of the shots are going to lose the effect of the stylistic choice that you had originally made. Again, another disclaimer on this, it's just like auto exposure. If you're doing a vlog or if you're doing a YouTube video or something super run and gun that you just want to get out there, totally fine, be my guest, use auto white balance, but professional shoots, try to stay away from that. As you can see in this example here, this is what it would look like if you were to use auto white balance, and in the middle of the shot, all of a sudden your colors are changing and your color grade is going from looking really good to looking not so good. Here's an example of a properly white balanced image. As you can see, it maintains the same colors throughout the whole entire scene and the whole entire sequence, and you're not seeing any change of colors. Now, getting into the last mistake that I see beginning filmmakers make is too much movement. Now, you'll watch all these YouTube videos and you'll see people saying movement is key. The best way to make your shots cinematic are movement. I'm not saying movement is bad. I'm saying too much movement is bad. One example I saw of this is I was shooting some ads for a restaurant, and the behind the scenes shooter that I had was walking around way too much with the camera and trying to cover a ton of different angles in the same shot. Now, this can be bad because that whole entire shot might be blown just because you're moving too much. You might be moving right when you need that part of a scene and then there's too much shake, or you might move too much and it's jarring for the audience. Just like the first roll, there are times when a lot of movement is a good thing. Say it's a fight scene or you're going for that handheld look. But in this case, for this poker game, we're looking for a slow and a moody vibe to this sequence. So as you can see here in the bad example, going from looking at the front of our subject, and then as he picks up his cards, we walk around to the back of the subject, you can see it's super shaky and there's too much movement. Now in the good example here, you can see we have an image of our subject from the front, and as he looks at his cards, we will pan up to his face. The one thing about too much movement, if you think there's going to be too much movement, just take extra shots. You can always have extra B-roll, extra coverage from different angles. It's okay to stop your camera and start at a new angle. It'll make your films and your commercials and your ads so much better than just continuous shots from one angle moving to the next one in the same shot. So for too much movement, make sure you block out your shots beforehand, block out your movement beforehand, and remember, less is more in most cases. Once you know these rules, you can spin off of them, do whatever you want, but having these rules ingrained in your head to begin with allows you to pivot off of them to make stylistic choices. So thank you for watching this video. Hopefully that helps some of you guys that are just beginning in filmmaking. I promise this time I will not wait 5 months to post another video. I have another one queued up for you guys. So with that being said, I will see you guys when I see you. Actually, I'll never see you because I'm looking at a camera, but maybe one day I'll see you. Maybe one day we'll do a trip. All of us, we'll just do a trip.